Okay, let's get started. This is week 2 of Introduction to Composition and Research. You'll notice that the title, as I describe it, is a little different. I think I mentioned this last week than the actual title in the catalog. This class covers 2 basic things. One is composition, how to write intelligibly, how to write accurately, how to write a research paper. The other is research, where to look for information. I think the title in the school catalog says something about library research methods, and we will get to that. The library is your friend. The library is not your only friend for research and background information. This week, the assignment for the week is to write a bulletin article, 350 to 500 words, basically a 1-page, roughly 3-paragraph, maybe 4-paragraph article on a biblical theme of your choice. It may be a topical article, it may be a textual article, but notice that it should be didactic in character. That is, it should be a teaching article. It should set out to teach some aspect of biblical truth. It's meant to inform and instruct. This is due next week. Now, I want to begin tonight by discussing, by setting before you, and I'll do this most every week, some non-standard and commonly misused expressions. I'm going to get over here and get a pen. Marker. You'll notice the 7 principles of clear writing on the board behind me. This is from last week. I'm going to go ahead and erase this. If you don't recall these, or if you haven't seen these, you can view the archive of last week's classes, and you'll see these being written in real time, and you'll find them in the class notes as they're distributed, and there will be class notes distributed. But commonly misused expressions, non-standard expressions, just, dare I say, a random assortment of things that people commonly say that are not actually correct. Number 1, all the farther. Now, maybe you've never heard this. I was not familiar with this when I was introduced to it many years ago, but in some segments of the country, all the farther is a common expression. But what it means is as far as. Now, as far as is a perfectly correct grammatical expression. All the farther makes no sense grammatically. A very related one, non-standard, all the faster. All the faster what? What are we trying to say when we say all the faster? Well, in some sections of the nation, that is a roundabout, non-standard way of saying as fast as. As fast as you can go. All the faster you can go. All the faster, what? That's non-standard. It's not correct. Now, you will notice, if you were paying attention, I used a moment ago one of these non-standard expressions in introducing this subject. Perhaps you didn't catch it. I said we'll do this most every week. Most is a perfectly good standard English word. However, most is not a correct substitute for almost. So, to correct what I said a moment ago, we will do this. We will review some non-standard and commonly misused expressions almost every week in this class. Now, here's one that is a perfectly correct grammatical word, but it's misused in its context. Already. Already. What does already mean? Already expresses surprise. This has taken place already. It expresses the idea of sooner than expected. However, already is not the same as all ready. They were all ready to go to the ball game. They were not already to go to the ball game. Now, perhaps they arrived early. They're here already, but they were not here already. It's possible to be both. They were already unexpectedly soon here, and they were all ready to play. But see, this encompasses all of someone or something. This is an expression of time. Two entirely different meanings and words. Here's one that you'll find in the media. An allusion, which is not the same as an illusion. An allusion, allusion, is a reference to something else, an oblique reference. To allude to something, allude, is to make reference to it. An illusion is a deceptive appearance. It appears to be one thing when it is either non-existent or it is something else entirely. A related set of words. Allude, allude. That is to refer to something. That is not the same as elude, elude, which means to escape or to get away from. Entirely different words, commonly interchanged incorrectly. I like a lot of salt on my chips. I don't like salt-free chips, but I do not like a lot. A-L-O-T. A lot is not a word. It is not a correct English word. And it is not the same as a lot. A lot, I like a lot. I like a large amount. This is not a word. Any good teacher will mark you off for using this in your writing. One other, and we'll dispense with this for tonight. This word, L-E-A-D, is not this word, L-E-D. Yes, I know that LED is also an acronym for light emitting diode. However, this is the word lead, as in to go before, or this is the word lead, as in the essential element lead for fishing weights and bullets and things like that, plumbum, as the Romans called it, the atomic symbol PB. LED is the past tense of to lead. He led his men. He led his men. Now, we look at that and say that doesn't make sense because read, R-E-A-D, the past tense of read is read. R-E-A-D, spelled the same way. So lead, the past tense should be led, L-E-A-D. L-E-A-D is either the present tense active form verb to go before, to lead, or it refers to a very heavy essential element, lead, like a fishing weight. The past tense is led, L-E-D. Make no mistake. This does not spell led when it means to go before. Nobody ever said English is logical or consistent. All right. A sentence to complete. Mark this down. Remember this. It is important to write clearly because it is important to write clearly. We could even add the word accurately. Because, and here's the reason. 3 words. Words mean things. It is important to write clearly because words mean things. The way that you create in the mind of a reader or in the mind of a listener, what exists in your mind, the image, the idea, the thought, the concept, is with words. The right word, well chosen and properly applied, enables you to create in the mind of the hearer or the reader the same idea, the same image, the same concept that is in your mind. Take your Bible and turn to Ephesians chapter 3 and notice what the Apostle Paul says to the Ephesian Christians there. In Ephesians chapter 3, Paul, a Jew by birth and by heritage and by culture, a Christian by persuasion, conviction, and choice, is writing to Gentile Christians primarily, whose background is not Judaism at all, but paganism or atheism or some variety of heathenism, but they are Gentile Christians. They have heard the gospel message, they have believed it, they have obeyed it, they have common ground with the Apostle Paul. And so Paul writes to them and says, when you read this, verse 4, this is the English Standard Translation. When you read this, well, what's he talking about? He's talking about the stewardship of God's grace that was given to him, the mystery that was made known to him by revelation, that mystery being the gospel and salvation through Jesus Christ. So when you read this, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of Christ, which was not made known to the sons of men in other generations, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. What did Paul just tell the Ephesian Christians? In a nutshell, that passage says, when you, Gentile Christians with pagan and heathen and atheistic backgrounds, completely different cultural backgrounds than mine, when you read what I, Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, a Christian hating, persecuting Jew, a Pharisee, a rabid Pharisee of Pharisees, when you read what I write, you should be able to understand what I understand in exactly the same way I understand it. The difference in cultures, the difference in backgrounds, perhaps the difference in native tongue or dialect makes no difference. They should be able to see in their mind's eye the same image, the same information, the same understanding, and that should bring them to the same conclusion that Paul had reached. So, it's important to write clearly because words mean things. Flip over to 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and just notice there, as Paul is writing to the Corinthian Christians, he actually says something that's, in a sense, very similar in sentiment to what we just read in Ephesians chapter 3. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, the context of chapters 12, 13, and 14 is the Apostle Paul discussing the existence of, the misuse of, and the proper use of spiritual gifts or miraculous abilities that were a part of Christianity in the first generations of the church in the first century. And these things were given in order to arrest attention and confirm the message, to confirm the word, because those Christians could not simply pick up a New Testament and read it. It had not yet been recorded at that point. So at chapter 12, he talks about these spiritual gifts and their misuse by some in the church at Corinth. In chapter 13, what we commonly call the love chapter of the Bible. Notice in your Bible, by the way, that there's no open blank space between the end of chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13, or the end of chapter 13 and the beginning of chapter 14. In reality, these three chapters ought to be the longest one chapter of the New Testament, because it's all one piece, all one discourse, if you will. So in chapter 12, he talks about the Corinthians' problem of misusing spiritual gifts and how that they need to focus on being one body. Chapter 13, he says, you need to understand that there is something far greater than all of these spiritual gifts that some of the Corinthians were so enamored with. And that greater thing is love. And then in chapter 14, he comes to the summary of this and says, all right, now here's how you should properly use these spiritual gifts. Pursue love, earnestly desire spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy and not just speak in tongues and so forth. Come down to verse 6, and he says, now, brothers, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will I benefit you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching? If even lifeless instruments, such as the flute or the harp, do not give distinct notes, how will anyone know what is played? If the bugle gives an indistinct sound, who will get ready for battle? Now listen to verse 9. So with yourselves, if with your tongue you utter speech that is not intelligible, and that word means clear or plain, understandable. If you utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anyone know what is said? For you will be speaking into the air. Preaching is fundamental. But preaching that is not intelligible, that is not clear, is wasted breath. Unless you utter by the tongue words easy to understand, how will it be known what is spoken? Communication depends on clarity. Clarity of speech in the pulpit, in the classroom, and clarity of writing. Now, the sentence is the basic unit of language. We talked about this a little bit last week, but I want to come back to this and reinforce this. A sentence may consist of a single word, or it may run on more than 100 words in the idea that it's expressing, especially if that's a complex idea. Regardless of how long the sentence is, it should give the reader a sense of relative completeness. It should express a complete thought as it stands. Let me close this door. Sentence patterns differ from language to language, from one language to another. And that, we talked about this a little bit last week. That explains the challenge of attempting to translate a text literally, to make literally a word for word translation, because the order of words varies from language to language. We illustrated this last week with the simple declaration, I love you, in English and in German and in Spanish. It's pretty similar between English and German, but it's a complete reversal of word order in Spanish. Likewise, in Greek and in Hebrew and in Aramaic, word order in the languages in which the scriptures were originally recorded is sometimes dramatically different than in modern English. So, a genuinely word-for-word translation makes no sense to the reader oftentimes, because the order of the words is what actually gives them the meaning that the writer intended to convey to the reader. For almost 50 years now, my preferred text for studying the scriptures has been the American Standard Version of 1901. Not the New American, but the original American Standard Version, which is the first major update, you might say, in the English language since the production of the King James Version. The American Standard Version is now an obscure text. It's hard to find. It's published by almost no one, but it is an excellent translation in many respects. It is, in the opinion of most grammarians, the hardest English translation to read. However, worse than the King James Version. Many years ago, when I was college aged, it was generally accepted that the New International Version of the scriptures was written on or translated on about a 6th grade reading level. And the New King James Version, which was then brand new, was at about a 7th grade reading level. The New American Standard Version was considered to be about 10th grade reading level. And the King James Version was considered to be high school senior 12th grade reading level. The American Standard Version scored 14th grade, or in other words, it was considered to be to require college sophomores' reading skills to be able to read it comfortably and understand it. Given the dramatic decline in reading abilities now, the King James and the American Standard, by those metrics, are functionally unreadable by most young people today. I say all that because the American Standard's strength has been its precision in translation. Perhaps its greatest weakness has been its readability, because it almost, in some passages, almost slavishly follows the word order of the Hebrew and Greek texts from which it is translated. And that makes it a very challenging English translation to read and from which to study. The order of words is what gives them meaning, gives them the meaning that the writer intends. Word order matters. And in 21st century English, most people don't pay very much attention to word order, or punctuation for that matter. Communication in speech, verbally, audibly, depends as much on volume, pitch, inflection, and tone as it does on the actual words spoken. Add to this the visual cues of body language and facial expression and so forth, and you have a complete package, so that oftentimes you can understand what's being said even when you cannot hear it clearly when you're communicating in person. In writing, and that's what this class is about, the words and the sentence patterns that you put together must combine with punctuation in order to express all of those things that in audible speech are apparent by the appearance, the sound, the tone, the inflection, the volume. So in writing, the choice of words, the pattern of the sentences, the arrangement of the words, combined with punctuation, is intended to express the information that's conveyed by gestures, by facial expressions, by tone and volume. Speech can express a great deal with a single word. A young man gets down on one knee at the feet of the girl that he has dated and with whom he has fallen deeply in love. He opens a little box containing a diamond ring, asks, "Will you, my beloved, be my wife?" And her answer, one word, has the power to lift his heart above the clouds or dash it to the darkest depths of despair. Whether she says yes or no, that one word says it all. Speech can express much with a single word. Writing depends almost completely on relatively complete sentences. Now let's talk about sentence structure. Let me erase this behind me so we have a little space. Sentence structure is something we don't usually think very much about. We don't give much thought to it because we speak without needing, in most cases, to consider exactly how we're going to express ourselves. Whether it is that we speak without thinking first and then pay the penalty of that, or we speak and express ourselves accurately anyhow. The structure of the sentence in speech, in spoken communication, the structure of the sentence can be overcome, or the poor structure of a sentence can be overcome by all of the visual and audible cues that accompany speech. In writing, the structure of the sentence is paramount. Nearly all regular or full sentences have two basic parts. We talked about this a little bit indirectly last week. Sentence structure. Let me pause here. If the things I am talking about give you flashbacks, bad flashbacks, to freshman high school English, I'm sorry. These are the things that you should have learned in the 7th, 8th, 9th grade, if not before. Nearly all regular or full sentences have two basic parts. They have a subject and a predicate. I hope that you're able to read that. I see there's a little bit of glare on that screen from the lights. I'll tilt that. Well, that doesn't seem to help. But it says full sentences have two basic parts. Part one is the subject. Part two is called the predicate. Now, looking at these things, the subject and the predicate are related by their meaning. The subject identifies who or what is doing what the predicate states. Who or what does this action in the predicate? The specific information about this action is the verb in the predicate. So, very simple examples. Let me put these over here. I think we can get these on the screen. Simple examples. Number one, dogs bark. That's a complete sentence. It's a declarative statement. Dogs, there's your subject. Subject. Bark, there's your predicate. That tells you what dogs do. Dogs are the who or the what. Bark is the action in the predicate. Dogs bark. It's a simple subject, simple predicate. That means you can't get any plainer, any simpler than that. Now, let's make this a compound subject. Number two, dogs and foxes bark. Now you have what's called a compound subject. Dogs and foxes with a simple predicate. Dogs and foxes, there's your subject. Bark, simple predicate. One action, one activity. We can make this a little more complex, or we can shift the complexity of it. Let's shift the complexity first and say dogs bark and run. Now we have a simple subject, dogs, just one object in the subject, one who or what, but a compound predicate, dogs bark and run, two different verbs. They both apply, both activities belong to the dog, to the dogs. Now, let's complicate it by simplifying it once again. Number four, dogs on the farm bark. Guess what we have? We have a simple subject, dogs. We have a simple predicate, bark. What about this on the farm business? That's additional information, but it is not essential to the sentence. So it's still a simple subject, even though it is qualified. It gives us more information. Let's reverse the order of things. Dogs run all over the farm. Simple subject, dogs. Simple predicate, run. All over the farm doesn't change the basic meaning of the sentence. But now, let's combine all of this together. angry dogs and foxes run around and bark loudly. What have we just done? We have combined a compound subject, dogs and foxes, with a compound predicate, run and bark. In this, we have adjectives that describe the dogs, angry dogs, and describe the foxes, angry foxes. The description is an adjective. They run. How do they run? They run around. How do they bark? They bark loudly. These, around and loudly, are adverbs. They qualify or they describe the manner of running and the manner of barking. All of the sentences that we've just put on the board qualify as simple sentences because there's only one subject predicate relationship. Even though you have a compound subject and a compound predicate, there's only one subject predicate relationship in each sentence. A subject predicate group, the combining of the subject and the predicate, is called a clause. Compound and complex sentences are made by joining two or more clauses in various ways. So, a compound sentence and a complex sentence are not the same thing. Now, as I said, if you're flashing back to the agony of Mrs. Elliott's fourth grade grammar class or something like that, I apologize for putting you through that, but these are things that are essential, absolutely essential to clear, accurate expression in print. So, a compound sentence. Compound sentences are made up of what would be simple sentences if they were separated. The clauses, the subject predicate relationships of each clause of a compound sentence would have approximately equal importance, and they can stand independently if they're broken up. Let me give you an example. Dogs run and bunnies hop. Here's a compound sentence. It has two distinct clauses. Clause number one, dogs run. Clause number two, bunnies hop. You have two statements that could each stand as independent sentences, but they're joined together by this little word and. Now that joining word is what we call a conjunction, a word that joins clauses together. A coordinating conjunction. We could also substitute the word but we need to add a comma there. Dogs run, comma, but bunnies hop. Does not change the nature of the sentence, though it changes the tenor of it, the tone of it, because now we have a contrast rather than a conjunction. Dogs run and bunnies hop. Dogs run, but bunnies hop. We could also use punctuation in place of the coordinating conjunction and say dogs run, semicolon, rabbits or bunnies hop. We can add on and say dogs run, bunnies hop, horses gallop, or maybe horses trot. Dogs run and horses trot, but rabbits hop. All of these different things form what are called compound sentences. Sentences where each clause, each subject-predicate relationship could stand by itself as a complete and correct sentence. Now, let's talk about complex sentences. Complex sentences. Okay. Like a compound sentence, a complex sentence joins two or more clauses. The difference between a compound sentence and a complex sentence is that in the compound sentence, the clauses, whether they're 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10, the clauses are all, roughly speaking, comparable, equal in weight. No one of them is noticeably more important or emphatic than the other. In a complex sentence, complex sentences join two or more clauses that are not equal in importance. One is more important than the other. For instance, the dogs bark loudly. Now, this is a simple sentence. This is not a complex sentence as it stands. This is one clause. Dogs is the subject. Bark loudly is the predicate. Loudly is the adverb that tells us how the dogs bark. It describes the quality of the verb, the barking. And then we can say the dogs live on the hill. And again, we have a simple sentence here. This is not a complex sentence by itself. The dogs, the subject, live, that's the predicate, the verb, that's what they're doing, they're living. And on the hill describes where they live. It describes the location. But now, let's combine these together. The dogs, sorry, I can't write well tonight. The dogs that live on the hill bark loudly. What's the focus of this sentence? This is your complex sentence. It has joined these two simple sentences together in one sentence. But what have we done? We have a simple subject, the dogs, and a compound or complex rather, predicate. The dogs, what are they doing? They're living on the hill and they're barking loudly. What has happened? The second sentence, the dogs live on the hill, has become what's called a subordinate clause to the first sentence. See, here's our first sentence here. The dogs bark loudly. This part, that live on the hill, is not essential to the basic structure of the sentence. It's additional information. It's a subordinate clause. You see, you can take this part out, that live on the hill, take it out, erase it completely, and what do you have? The dogs bark loudly. That's a complete sentence. But you take away the dogs bark loudly, and what do you have? That live on the hill. That's not a complete sentence. That's a subordinate clause. That means this part, that live on the hill, depends on the subject and the predicate to have meaning. So, we could reverse this, change the emphasis of it, and say, the dogs that bark loudly live on the hill. What have we done? We've just reversed which clause is subordinate. The dogs is still our subject, still the focus of who or what. The dogs live on the hill. There's our main sentence. The dogs live on the hill. That bark loudly is our subordinate clause. That's the part that's not essential to have a complete sentence. You can take that part away, you still have a complete sentence. But that part, that bark loudly, cannot stand on its own. That part joined with the subject. If you omit the predicate here, the dogs that bark loudly, that's not a complete sentence in most scenarios. It could be a complete sentence in response to a question. Which dogs are we talking about? We're talking about the dogs that bark loudly. But as it is constructed here, it's not a complete sentence without the dominant clause, without the main part of the sentence. So, in a nutshell, a sentence must contain at least one subject and predicate sequence or independent clause. If two or more subject predicate sequences are put into a sentence, they can be connected in various ways. They can be connected with a coordinated conjunction. That's a compound sentence. Dogs run and, or but, or semicolon. Bunnies hop. If they're not equal in importance, then the less important idea is subordinated to the more important idea, and that's a complex sentence. The dogs bark loudly. The dogs that live on the hill bark loudly. That might be in contrast to the dogs that live down in the valley. Maybe they bark softly. Components of compound and complex sentences can be combined. You can create a sentence. The Apostle Paul, the Holy Spirit working through the Apostle Paul was astoundingly, and sometimes maddeningly efficient at combining compound and complex components in the same sentence. Now, we'll come back after we take about a 10-minute break and talk briefly about some common errors to avoid both in speech and in writing. But suffice it to say that what I said and what I meant are not necessarily the same thing. Errors in subject and verb agreement, passive verb forms instead of active ones, overly formal sentence construction, all contribute to what Robert Gunning describes as fog in the reader's understanding. We'll take about a 10-minute break. All right, let's begin again. And here we're going to begin with some common errors to avoid, both in speech and in writing. And like I said, what I said and what I meant are not necessarily the same thing. I want to introduce you to the three most common grammatical errors in subject-verb relationships. Problem number one, error number one. Problems of agreement in number. We talked about this a little bit last week. I illustrated this just slightly last week. The point is that a subject should agree in number with its verb. Nouns and verbs both have singular and plural forms. To illustrate, the correct version is the men, plural, have, plural, come. Men is a plural noun. Have is a plural verb form. The incorrect version would be to say the men has come. Here you have a plural noun with a singular verb. The men has come? No, the men hasn't come. The men have, plural. More than one man. Multiple men have arrived. Mistakes in subject and verb agreement, number agreement, usually occur when a phrase or a clause comes between the subject and its verb. To illustrate, the men you sent to repair the furnace has come. What's wrong? You have a plural noun, men. You have a singular verb, has. How did we end up with a plural noun and a singular verb? What was it that threw this off? The clause in the middle. Because here we have a singular noun, and And that's what throws people off sometimes. You have a singular noun, you put a singular noun with a singular verb, except this whole part you sent to repair the furnace. That's a dependent clause. It depends on the independent clause, which is incorrectly formed because the writer was sidetracked by this singular noun in the dependent clause. This should be the men, plural, have, plural, come. Period. The men you sent to repair the furnace have come, have arrived. Now, a collective noun takes a singular verb. If the group, the collective, is thought of or presented as a unit. But it takes a plural verb if the individual members of the group are being considered separately. If you're talking about a flock of geese, what's the noun? The noun is flock, not geese. Geese tells you what kind of flock. Geese, of geese, is an adjective. It tells you what kind of flock, but there's only one flock. The flock of geese flew overhead. One flock flew, singular, singular. But if we're talking about the individual geese, now we need a plural verb. Let me illustrate it this way. Oops, didn't mean to erase that part. Number one, problems of agreement in number. Okay, let's erase the illustrations. I suppose if I were more tech savvy and planned ahead better, I could do all of this on PowerPoint slides and share my screen with you. It'd be easier than reading my pathetic handwriting on the board. But that's not natural to my teaching style. So, to illustrate this again, the difference between a collective noun being thought of as a unit or a single group and the members of the group being considered separately. Number one, letter A. The family goes to church. Let's make it goes to worship at 10 o'clock. We're talking about the entire group. Family goes. One family, one verb. Single family, single verb. One family goes as a family, as a group. But let's reverse the idea here. By 10 o'clock, the family were all in worship. Now, we're considering the individual members of the family. We have a plural noun, a collective, and a plural verb, because we're looking at the individuals in the collective noun, the plural collective. That's grammatical challenge or grammatical problem number one. Let's move on to number two. Common error to avoid. Number two, which would be active versus passive voice. This gets to the way we express our verbs, the way we use verbs. The difference between active and passive voice is the difference between the subject of a sentence doing something and the subject of the sentence having something done to it, receiving the action. As a general rule, this is not a hard and fast, ironclad rule. Generally speaking, active voice is preferred to the passive voice for clarity of expression. Let me illustrate. Active voice. I took the book. What's your subject? I'm the subject. I alone. What's your verb? Took. Active voice. I'm doing the acting. That's active voice. The subject is doing the acting. The book is the object of the action. Passive voice would phrase it this way. The book was taken by me. Now we have a passive construction. The book receives the action. By me expresses who did it, but it doesn't express me doing it in real time. The book is what's being acted upon. The book is the focus, not me. I see this passive construction every week in church bulletins and church announcements. When we gather for worship, someone will begin to say, we are in need of so many plates or cups or desserts for an upcoming fellowship meal or what have you. That's the passive construction. We are in need of. The active construction is we need this, that, or the other, which is simpler and more direct. We need, or we are in need of. Why do we say we are in need of? We are in need of 5 words when we could simply say we need 2 words. Why do we do this? Because of the incorrect and misbegotten sense that somehow we are in need of is more correct or more proper, more highfalutin than we need. It's not more correct. The passive form is not more correct. as if there is such a thing as more correct. Something is either correct or it's not. It's not more correct. It's either correct or it's not. The passive form is grammatically correct, but the active form should be preferred because it also is correct and it's more direct, simpler, and usually clearer. Simplicity and clarity are your friends when you write. Now, I mentioned something last week that Robert Gunning wrote about overly formal sentence structure and using the passive voice when the active voice will serve equally well or better is a prime example of overly formal sentence structure. Overly formal sentence structure. Any student who has ever been given an assignment to write a 500-word theme has been tempted to write using overly formal sentence structure because it uses more words. We are in need of, that's 5 words down. We need, oh, that's only 2 words. I'm going to say we are in need of because that gets me 3 words closer to my 500-word requirement. Why don't you put more information and more vivid descriptions into your theme instead of unneeded words? Robert Gunning wrote, if a reader doesn't understand what you write, he is dumb in the slang sense of the word. We mentioned this last week. But in the proper sense of the word, if the reader misunderstands what you write, you are dumb. You have failed to communicate and you have wasted time, energy, ink, and good, clean white paper. Good writing goes beyond the mere recording of facts. To have effect, writing must communicate facts to readers. All right. Now, Gunning illustrates this point in this way. This is examples of overly formal writing. 2 guys working in an office. One office worker meets another guy in the hallway, says, Joe, if you need more stickers, just ask for them. His message, 9 simple words. Joe, if you need more stickers, ask us for them. Simple, straightforward. Those 9 words deliver the thought simply, directly, effectively. Anybody can understand that. What more is there to say? If you need more stickers, ask us for them. But Joe says, send me a memo about that. So the same man goes into his office, sits down, and writes this message. If the supply of stickers sent you is not sufficient to meet your requirements, apply to this office for additional copies. What? 9 simple, direct, clear words have inflated into 21 words that the average reader has to read 3 or 4 times in order to understand. To write well and to write simply, you have to train your mind to cut through surface details and get to the bones of the thought. To write well and simply, train your mind to cut through surface details and get at the bones, the skeleton of your thought. Said it last week, say it again. I may repeat it every week. Clarity of style cannot replace clarity of thought. Generally speaking, successful writers are those who have something to say, number one, and have learned to say it simply, number two. There has never been a writer who gained a larger audience by making his style more complicated than his thoughts required. Take your Bible and turn to 2 Peter chapter 3. And notice the Apostle Peter's inspired, this is the Holy Spirit's assessment of some of the things that the Apostle Paul was inspired to write. In 2 Peter chapter 3, almost at the end of the chapter, Peter writes in verse 14, "Therefore, beloved, since you are waiting for these," that is, new heavens, new earth in verse 13, "since you are waiting for these, be diligent to be found by him," that is Christ, "without spot or blemish, and at peace, and count the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as our beloved brother Paul also wrote to you according to the wisdom given him, as he does in all his letters when he speaks in them of these matters. There are some things in them," that is, in Paul's letters, "that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do also the other scriptures." The Holy Spirit's inspired assessment of some of the things that he himself inspired Paul to write for us is that they're complicated. They're hard, they're challenging to understand. Some things are complicated, and they require complicated language. Most things are not complicated. So don't complicate them with overly complicated language. Now, let me give you 10 principles of clear writing. And this is very similar to what we looked at last week. This is actually an enlargement of what we looked at last week. In fact, let me double check something quickly. "10 Principles of Clear Writing" by Robert Gunning. We'll just put these up here in rapid form. You could almost summarize these with the old familiar KISS acronym. Keep it simple, you know who. Number one, keep sentences short. That does not mean that long sentences are necessarily inherently bad. Take your Bible, flip over to Ephesians chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. You'll find some of the longest sentences in all the New Testament. And they're inspired by the Holy Spirit, recorded by the Apostle Paul. Paul's writing is wonderfully precise and accurate, but it's sometimes complex and compound because his subject matter is complex and compound. Generally speaking, principles of clear writing: keep sentences short. Don't make them longer than they need to be. Number 2, prefer simple over complex. If you can say something simply, say it simply. If it requires complexity, say it as simply as you're able. Number 3, prefer familiar words. A number of years ago, I subscribed to a monthly paper published by one of our brethren who was a scholar, a wonderful wordsmith, an extraordinary Bible student, an excellent preacher and teacher. But for all of his scholarship and his ability, he was a man enwrapped in a love affair with obscure words. He introduced me through that periodical, which is no longer published, hasn't been published in several decades. But he introduced me through that periodical to a number of words that I did not know existed. And given the father in whose house I grew up, I have a rather large English vocabulary. Let me give you an example. A-N-E-N-T. Anent. Have you ever used that word in a sentence? I would speak unto thee anent thy impending marriage. I would speak unto thee anent the late conflagration. I speak unto thee this evening anent the Holy Spirit. You begin to get the idea of what the word anent means? That's an old English word for about. Now, how many of us knew that? I actually had to go get my Webster's dictionary and look up that word because it was used in the title of an article, and I had no idea what it meant. And when I read the definition and realized anent means about, my first thought was, brother, why didn't you just say about? But as I said, this is a brother who had a passionate love affair with obscure words. He used them correctly. But as a general rule, prefer familiar words. Your readers will appreciate you for that. Number 4, avoid unnecessary words. We are in need of. No, we need. 3 unnecessary words. Number 5, put action in your verbs. Put action in your verbs. I took the book, not the book was taken by me. Put action in your verbs. Make them direct. Number 6, don't take this literally. Take this literarily. Write like you talk. I put that in quotes. Don't take it literally. Take it literarily. What do you mean by that? If you are accustomed to using slang and casual grammar, please don't write with slang and casual grammar. If the most complicated thing that you write in the course of the day is a text message where you spell the past tense of to eat with the digit, with the numeral 8, not the digit, that's a finger, with the numeral 8, don't write as you speak. What this means is write actively, write simply, write in the same manner that you would speak. Number 7, use terms your reader can see or picture. Use terms your reader can imagine, can see in their mind's eye. Number 8, try to tie in with your reader's experiences. In my preaching and my teaching in recent years, the last 15 years or so, I have begun to realize that I need to work on this particular point because most of the people to whom I speak in sermons and Bible classes and things are so much younger than I am and come from so different a background than I do, that things that are familiar, readily accessible illustrations and examples for me are things with which they have no familiarity at all. My grandfathers were born, my father's father was born in 1890. This is 2021. My father's father was born in the 19th century, and we're in the 21st century. My father grew up on a farm. Both of my grandfathers were farmers. I spent my childhood and youth on farms and around animals and farm equipment, even though my father was not a farmer. Aspects of that rural agrarian background are very familiar to me. But in the last 15 years, I have begun to realize that in that respect, I have more in common with the people I read about in my New Testament than I do with the people to whom I am speaking, because they have no connection to such things. Let me pause this for just a moment. Okay, as I was saying, use terms that your readers can picture. Tie in with your reader's experience. Number 9, and this challenges some of us more than it may others, make full use. Make full use of variety. What's the old expression about variety? Variety is the spice of life. Make full use of variety in your teaching, in your preaching, whether it is in the style of sermon you preach, textual versus topical, expository versus narrative, or whether it's in the subject matter, Old Testament, New Testament. Make full use of variety. Use variety in your illustrations. It makes your lessons and your writing memorable. It makes them live. Number 10. Write to express not to impress. Write to express, not to impress. That gets to that overly complicated sentence formation. So these are general principles, not ironclad rules, but they are general principles that if you apply them, will stand you in good stead. They will make your writing clear, direct, sharp, readable, interesting. They will hold your reader's attention, and they will cause your reader to enjoy and appreciate what you write. And these things apply not just to writing term papers and research papers. They apply to writing Bible class material. They apply to writing sermon outlines. They apply to writing bulletin articles and blogs. They apply to writing love letters, for that matter. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. These things will make your writing soar. Now, let's go back to grammar. Now we're going to talk about things like comma splices and run-on sentences. All of those things from 4th and 5th grade grammar that gave you nightmares. Sentence fragments, comma splices, and run-on sentences. A sentence fragment. Sentence fragment is a string of words that lacks either a subject finite object, or a predicate. A finite verb, a specific verb. A sentence fragment is a string of words that lacks either a subject or a predicate, but is made part of a larger structure by the presence of relative pronouns, who, which, that, or a subordinating conjunction, because, if, when. Let me give you a couple of examples. Example number one. The reason for this reaction. Being that people are flattered by courtesy. That's a sentence fragment. That's not a complete sentence. Oh dear, I just realized that my computer is not actually plugged into power. That should solve that. Okay. The subject in this sentence lacks a finite, a definite verb predicate. The reason for this reaction, that seems to be our subject, doesn't it? Whatever the reason is. Well, the reason is explained. People are flattered by courtesy. People react by being flattered when someone treats them courteously. So we get the general idea, but it's not a correct sentence. There is not a finite verb that applies to the reason for the reaction. Now we can change this. We can correct it very simply. All we have to do to correct it is change the form of the verb. Cross out being and put in an active present verb. The reason for this reaction is that people are flattered by courtesy. Now you have a complete correct sentence. It's not a sentence fragment anymore. It is now a complete sentence, and all you did was change the form of the verb. A second example. This one is a little more complicated, longer. I shall not try to defend myself on the grounds that I did not violate the law. I shall not try to defend. I'd help if I could spell. Myself on the grounds that I did not violate the law. Now this part, this is a complete correct sentence. Here's the sentence fragment. Because I could offer the excuse that I didn't know such a law existed. Okay. The first part, I shall not try to defend myself on the grounds that I did not violate the law. Fine. That's a complete correct sentence. Adequate information, subject, predicate, correct in number, whole 9 yards, even active voice. The qualifier, though, because I could offer the excuse that I didn't know the law existed, such a law existed. The subordinating conjunction, because I could offer the excuse, that makes what follows it, because makes what follows it part of a larger structure. Take away all of this and just begin here. Because I could offer the excuse that I didn't know that such a law existed. That's not a complete sentence. Now, take away the word because. Make the sentence, I could offer the excuse that I didn't know such a law existed. That's fine. That's correct. But putting that conjunction, because, at the beginning of this sentence turns that into a dependent clause. It makes it part of a larger structure. It cannot stand by itself with that word. Remove the word, solve the problem. Remember principle number 1 of clear writing? Keep sentences short. Principle number 2, prefer the simple to the complex. A third example, and I won't write this on the board for time's sake, because time is getting away. Much information about a topic can be brought forth by poetry. Well, there you have a somewhat passive construction. It's a little bit roundabout, but it's not grammatically incorrect. Much information about a topic can be brought forth by poetry. Follow that up. The topic of science in particular, because science is basically factual, not only does that not even make sense in its content, you want to express science in a poetic fashion? Good luck. But here, you have a sentence fragment because the topic of science lacks a verb. The topic of science. Now, science is basically factual. That could stand as a complete sentence. But the topic of science, in particular, because science is basically factual, the topic of science lacks a verb. It's a sentence fragment. Sentence fragments are not always short. Sometimes they're long and convoluted, but when you break them down, they don't make good sense. Now let's talk just for a moment about comma splices. A comma splice, comma is that little grammatical symbol, looks like a period with a tail. A comma splice is where 2 or more complete simple sentences, independent clauses, are joined together with a comma. A comma splice is a punctuation error that results in a grammatical error. Independent clauses, complete simple sentences, can be properly joined, as we saw earlier, to form compound or complex sentences. You use coordinating conjunctions and, but, for, so. You use grammar like a semicolon or even a colon. But you don't just stick a comma in there to join two sentences together. An example. We're not allowed to speak, to think for ourselves, comma. That privilege is reserved for our teachers. You've got two complete sentences. Don't run them together with a comma. That sentence can be fixed in several different ways. You can make two complete sentences. We're not allowed to think for ourselves, period. That privilege is reserved for our teachers, period. Two sentences. Clear, direct, independent, simple. You could put a coordinating conjunction after or in place of that comma. We're not allowed to think for ourselves, comma, because that privilege is reserved for our teachers. Now you've taken two complete sentences and you have joined them into a compound sentence using both a comma, which is the visual equivalent of pause, and a coordinating conjunction, because that says these two things are basically equal in importance. You could substitute a semicolon for that comma. We're not allowed to think for ourselves, semicolon. That's a comma with a period over it. That privilege is reserved for our teachers. That's a comma splice. Comma splices are common in unskilled academic writing. Commas and apostrophes are probably the most abused and misused bits of punctuation in the English language. Our time, our allotted time on the clock, that is up for this class. We got started a bit late due to some traffic issues. And so we will stop here. We'll begin next week looking at what are called run-on, or sometimes described as fused sentences. Remember the assignment, 350 to 500 word theme on the biblical topic of your choice. It can be topical or textual. It is a didactic article meant to teach, to inform. And we'll see you next week. Thank you for being here. Good night.